Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Gillian Asquith. And Gillian and I share a love of letters on papyrus. And I am in awe of Gillian's command of the Greek and theology and all those wonderful things that you need to know to be able to read a letter on papyrus. Gillian works at the Melbourne School of Theology as a New Testament lecturer. She won a prize for her PhD from AUC, ACU, no, got around the wrong way, for her work. And her dissertation is going to be published with the SNTS dissertation series, which is an honour for Gillian. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Gillian, and she's going to speak to us on the socio-theological significance of the remembrance in Paul's letter openings. And I can't wait. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Well, Dr. Campbell has unknowingly provided a very helpful introduction to my paper, talking about Oxyrhynchus papyri, because I'm going to be talking about them as well. Memory played a large part in the relationship between people who were separated by physical distance in the ancient world. This afternoon, I'm going to look at mutual remembrance as an important theme between letter writers in antiquity. Correspondents would assure one another that they remembered their recipient in prayer, or just that they remembered their recipient full stop. Sometimes they would ask for reciprocation too. And these expressions of remembrance would contribute to maintaining a warm and friendly relationship between sender and recipient. The remembrance motif is the term that's been coined for these affirmations of remembrance. And I'm going to take you through some insights that documentary papyri provide for shedding new light on that little phrase in some of Paul's letter openings: I remember you in my prayers, or I mention you in my prayers, depending on what English version you're using. Well, the motif occurs 6 times in the Pauline corpus, 4 times in the undisputed letters, then in Ephesians and 2 Timothy. I'm going to stick mainly with the undisputed letters here. In 1 Thessalonians, there's also a remembrance, a reference to mutual remembrance later in the letter body, where Paul's not talking so much about how he remembers the Thessalonians, but he's mentioning their remembrance of him. And all of these instances use the Greek word mnea. In the remembrance motif in Romans, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon, mnea occurs in a verb-noun phrase with the verb pieomai. So I'm going to refer to that as a collocation later on. In Philippians, mnea occurs absolutely on its own. So there's Philemon, you can see it with mnean and pioumenos, and then here in Philippians, just mnea is there on its own. The collocation is glossed sometimes with an equivalent collocation in English, sometimes glossed as make remembrance or make mention. That's more formal in English. So you'll often find that English versions will render that same phrase less formally with just a verb, remember or mention. So let's have a look at the remembrance motif as it occurs in epistolary papyri. And we see that same collocation, mnean piome, in a number of letter openings. So here's one from a 2nd century BCE letter. Theophila to Diognetos, her brother, greetings and a healthy and sorrow-free life always. I myself am also well, and I do not cease to remember you a lot. Here's another earlier one from the 3rd century BCE. Heraclitos to Xenon, greetings. If you yourself are well and the rest of your affairs are in order, then it would be as we wish. We ourselves are well too. and we continue to remember you all the time. Well, those of you who are familiar with ancient letter writing conventions will have spotted that the remembrance motif occurs in the section of an ancient letter that's entirely formulaic. So there's the superscript and adscript, A to B. Then there's the salutation, greetings. There's a health wish that provides news of the letter writer, health wish towards the recipient, and then news of the letter writer as well, and then the remembrance motif. So that invites the question, is the remembrance motif merely a convention, a general expression of holding the recipient in one's memory that's trotted out without it really meaning anything? The kind of ancient world equivalent of, dear Auntie Flo, I hope you're well. Or does it signify something more? Well, there's a particular letter that provides a clue. It was written about 170 BCE by an angry wife called Isias. She's writing to her husband Hephaestion, and she's urging him to come home. Hephaestion was probably a soldier returning from active service, and he's written to inform his wife that rather than coming straight home, he's become a detainee by order of the god in a temple in Memphis. The point at which Isias is writing to Hephaestion, she indicates that things are not going well for her. Times are hard, food was short, and she's received a second-hand report that Hephaestion has actually been released from his duty as a detainee of the god, but he's staying on for a little holiday. So she suspects that he's now enjoying these relatively secure conditions within the temple precincts as a self-appointed detainee. So she starts her letter like this. Isias to Hephaestion, her brother, greetings. If you're well and your other affairs are according to plan, then it would be as I continue to pray to the gods. I myself am well too, and the child, and all in the household who always remember you. But if we look closely, we can see that the remembrance motif is an interlinear addition. So I'll show you where it's inserted here. Can you see that extra line there? It was an afterthought, but obviously a sufficiently important one to warrant addition. And I think the rest of the letter gives us a clue why. So in several places, Isias expresses her extreme displeasure with her husband. She expresses it in no uncertain terms. So first of all, she says, when I received your letter from Horos, in which you announced that you're in detention in the Serapion in Memphis, and for the news that you're well, I straight away thanked the god. But about your not coming home, when all the others who had been detained there have come, I am disgusted. A little later, she reiterates this same sentiment. Moreover, since Horos, who delivered the letter, reported that you have been released from detention, I am thoroughly disgusted. So it's easy to imagine that having composed an ending like that, Isias maybe feels that she needs to go back and soften the tone of her letter somewhat. And this is consistent with an observation that's recorded in an ancient handbook of letter writing, in which the writer is an ancient epistolary theorist called Pseudo-Demetrius. He talks about letters classified as the friendly type. And he says, the friendly type then is one that seems to be written by a friend to a friend. But it's by no means only friends who write in this manner. For frequently, those in prominent positions are expected by some to write in a friendly manner to their inferiors and to others who are their equals. For example, to military commanders, viceroys, and governors. There are times indeed when they write to them without knowing them personally. They do so not because they're close friends and have only one choice of how to write, but because they think that nobody will refuse them when they write in a friendly manner, but will rather submit and heed what they're writing. A more recent 20th century epistolary theorist called Heikki Koskaniemi, who's been looking at ancient Greek letters, He's identified a number of letter writing formula that contributed to this friendly manner of writing. And one of those formulae is, you guessed it, the remembrance motif. So far from the remembrance motif being an empty platitude, seems that Isias harnesses its function as an expression that's hopefully going to soften her husband towards receiving her letter favorably and hopefully coming home. Some ancient letters supply further evidence that the remembrance motif was more than a cliche. These letters link the remembrance motif overtly with the action of intercessory prayer. So here's one that dates to the late 1st century BCE. Licinios to Cassius, his brother, many greetings and good health. If you're well, I myself also am well. I make the best remembrance of you for your good in everything, before the gods that are in Coptus. The jury's out whether instances of the motif that don't specifically mention prayer are nevertheless implying intercessory prayer. I think they do, but not everyone would agree with that. But when it comes to Paul's letters, the motif is always linked with Paul's intercession for his recipients. I remember you in my prayers. Until now, I've been glossing menian piome in the remembrance motif as remember. But English versions are by no means in agreement over how to gloss this collocation. So here's a summary table of just a few versions. There's inconsistency between versions and even inconsistency within versions. And in the one that does display consistency, the NASB, the gloss is mention rather than remember. Commentators also disagree over whether menia should be glossed remembrance or mention. Some scholars use the two words interchangeably. Others prefer make mention for menian piome. They cite the difference between remembering, which they say is merely a thought directed backwards in time, and mentioning, which is presenting the object of the thought to God in prayer. Some scholars, that would include J.B. Lightfoot, Moule, more recently Earl J. Richard, these scholars appeal to the classical origins of the collocation, and they maintain that, menia on its own can mean remember, but when it's in collocation, it means mention. And they're in good company. BDAG and LSJ separate menia into two senses, mention and remembrance. And BDAG actually specifies that when it's in collocation, it means mention someone. But there's a problem here that seems to have gone unnoticed by commentators, New Testament translators, and lexicographers alike. Because this tension between mention, as commonly used in contemporary English, and the context of the remembrance motif in Paul's letter openings. Paul's assurances of remembrance occur in conjunction with reports of heartfelt prayer for his recipients. But mention in English, in both its verbal and noun forms, connotes a reference or a comment that's generally brief in nature and incidental to the main point. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the verb as to refer briefly and without entering into detail, and the noun as the action of remarking upon or introducing the name of a person or thing in spoken or written discourse, often incidentally, and as not necessarily essential to the discussion. But Paul's prayer reports convey the impression that the intercessions described in them are anything but brief or incidental. So, for example, the prayer reports in Philippians, they recount particular thanksgivings for the Philippians' partnership in the gospel, along with the desire for increasing discernment and maturity on their part. In 1 Thessalonians, the report details specific aspects of the Thessalonians' faith that Paul's thankful for. One scholar, Geoffrey Weimer, observes that the prayer reports conjure up a picture of the apostle on his knees, passionately praying to God on behalf of his readers. So these reports suggest a depth of prayer that's incongruent with a mere cursory reference. Two scholars, Marcus Barth and Jean Green, in their commentaries on Ephesians and 1 Thessalonians, respectively, do notice the intensity of Paul's intercessions, but they end up concluding that remembrance is far too weak an action to convey this intensity. It's only a cognitive process. So mania must be translated as mention. There's no mention, every pun intended, of the weakness of the verb mention itself. Then the problem's compounded by the fact that there is a semantic overlap between remember and mention in the context of prayer. To make mention necessarily entails remembering. And to remember in prayer requires some degree of articulation, whether it's audible or not. One scholar suggests that perhaps mania and the word for prayer, prosephi, seem to occupy the same semantic field. So we've got this tangled web of factors and opinions. But if we examine the lexicological trajectory of the word mention in English, then we see some interesting things coming to light. So the collocation, menian PMI, is rendered I make mention as far back as the Tyndale Bible, that's 1534. But this meaning of mention in English has changed since the 16th century. The Oxford English Dictionary notes that mention originally meant the action of calling to mind or commemorating something in speech or writing. There's an English, Latin, French dictionary of 1574 compiled by someone called John Barrett, and it contains the entry, to make mention of one. The Latin equivalent is given as referre memoriam aliquis, in English, to call someone or something to memory. But by the time Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language was published in 1755, mention had lost the idea of remembrance as a sense, and it was defined in that dictionary only as to write or express in words or writing. Then this more restrictive sense of a brief and incidental remark was first noted by the Oxford English Dictionary in 1908. So it appears that there's been this progressive development in the meaning of mention, and that's escaped the attention of translators, commentators, and lexicographers. I think it's most likely due to the fact that there's a very neat correspondence between the collocation menian PMI in Greek and the English I make mention, and that semantic overlap between mentioning and remembering in prayer. But if we think about how what mention was originally conveying in English, when William Tyndale used I make mention in 1534, he would have been conveying Paul's assurances that Paul called his recipients to mind in prayer, thanking God and interceding for them. But of course, Tyndale's translation then formed the basis of a series of further translations and revisions, and then the King James Version was eventually produced based on these previous translations and revisions. So make mention for menian PMI has remained throughout this series of revisions. It's continued to the present day. I think that's most likely due to the abiding influence of the King James Version. And then in the same way, there's been this steady stream of Greek English lexicons that have also provided make mention as a gloss. So they've presented an archaic meaning inherited from a centuries-old tradition as contemporary English. There's one dictionary that's slightly better. So the relatively new Cambridge Greek lexicon defines mania as the act of recalling in speech or writing. But that really just seems to derive from the Oxford English Dictionary's note on the archaic definition of mention in English. And if we look more closely at the way mania is used in Greek, we'll see that it actually doesn't even carry that idea of speech or writing necessarily. Happily for us, documentary papyri can tidy up this mess for us. When we turn to instances of mania in the papyri, we see that they attest three senses, and they all pertain to remembrance. And I've categorized these three senses as follows. So memory as a cognitive event, something purely internal. So you might use glosses like memory, recollection, remembrance, calling to mind. Then memory as a perpetuative event. So memory communicated for the purpose of drawing ongoing attention to the object of that memory. So commemoration, memorial, remembrance. And then memory as what we might call a performative event, something that transpires as an action. Remembrance that's accompanied by something responsive, where the nature of that responsive action is determined by the context. So the lexicon by Lowe and Nider note that we see this sense in the New Testament with the verb, the cognate verb for remembering, and mnemonevo in Galatians 2:10. So the pillars of the Jerusalem church stipulated in Galatians 2:10 that Paul should remember the poor. Here it is. Which in context, if you cast your minds back, refers to providing material assistance for them. It's not simply, oh, yeah, the poor, yeah, I remember them. English works in a similar manner to Greek here. To remember someone in a will refers to leaving them a legacy. To remember a charity at tax time refers to giving them a tax-deductible donation. We wouldn't define remember in a dictionary as carrying the sense of leave a legacy or make a tax-deductible donation. They're the responsive actions that are attached to the event of remembering, and they're supplied from the context. But they don't need to be spelled out, so long as there's sufficient shared cultural understanding between the communicator and the recipient. And we see one example of this in the papyri. It's in the Xenon archive. So it dates to 258 BCE. And for those of you who may be not familiar with the papyri, you may be thinking, how on earth are they so precise and specific with the date? You'll know from manuscripts that have parts of the New Testament written on them, they have to be dated by a style of handwriting. But the beautiful thing about these papyrus letters is that many of them are dated specifically to the day, if not at least to the year. So we know with accuracy that this dates to 258 BCE. It was written by a harpist who's complaining that she is owed wages and a clothing allowance. And so she writes to Xenon to ask Apollonius, who's the owner of the estate that they both live on, to pay up. And she uses mania in collocation with PMA. Obviously, she doesn't want Apollonius just to remember her. She wants him to pay up. So some instances convey memory as a cognitive event, as I noted earlier. So one influential individual writes a letter of recommendation to a local bureaucrat. He says, if you have any recollection of our friendship, then please do as I ask. Another comes from a frustrated mother to her uncommunicative son. And some things never change, do they? Was this why I carried you for 10 months and nursed you for 3 years, so that you would not know to remember me by letter? She uses just the normal default verb for remember there. But then in the next section, when she says, only I ask and entreat and adjure you by the memory of the man who begat you, if you're well, to sail away. That word memory there is mania. One of them attests memory as a perpetuative event. This doctor's will records his instructions for a monastery to construct a memorial to him as a commemoration of his all too short life. So none of these papyrological attestations, and there are more besides these, none of them indicate that mention should be counted as a legitimate gloss for Menhir. And just so that papyri don't steal all of the limelight, there's evidence from inscriptions as well. So there's an example here of where somebody has undertaken benefactions for the Athenian demos. It says he's taken upon himself and he maintains the love of honor towards the demos, and he's well disposed to all Athenians. He's continued to remember the freedom of the demos in the best way at every time. And the inscription goes on to narrate how the fellow secured peace terms for the Athenians at his own expense. So that's a description of his responsive actions. There's another one here. This responsive sense is even more visible in an inscription. It's honoring two usurers, actually. It says, the city also at appropriate times expressed gratitude and remembered them by decorating them with suitable honors. So I propose in my thesis and in my book that's due to be published that current lexicon entries require revision to excise mention as a separate sense of Menhir. And English versions of the New Testament need to render Menhir as remembrance, not mention. But there's more we need to note about Menhir briefly before we're done. And here I'm indebted to John Lee from Sydney and Macquarie Universities for demonstrating in a number of papers how the papyri can be used to investigate linguistic register. So that's the level of formality of a word or a phrase. And the work that I've done has identified that we tend to find Menhir in documents that are written by relatively high status individuals in letters that display a better than average command of Greek. The distribution of attestations also suggests that it was a literary word, and by at least the 2nd century BCE, it was rare in everyday written communication, and it never gained further popularity. So we can categorize it as a high register word that would have been used for literary effect, for ornamentation, or for emphasis by letter writers like Paul. And this is backed up by the fact that more instances of the remembrance motif in the papyri use a purely verbal form for remembering than the collocation. This one's an example here. So my research has discovered that there's a correlation between slipping high register alternatives into established letter writing formulae and a writer's intention to persuade their recipient of something or to seek a favorable response to their letter, like Isias with her husband who won't come home. So when Paul chooses to use Menhir in his remembrance motifs, he's drawing particular attention to the motif and the fact that he intercedes for his recipients. I suggest this is in part to help Paul secure a favorable reception for his letters, but I think more importantly, it intersects with the multifaceted significance of memory and remembrance in the Greco-Roman world and in Second Temple Judaism. In the Greco-Roman world, remembrance helped shape cultural identity, and the present was shaped through memorialization of the past. So public inscriptions, for example, commemorated events and people who'd contributed to forming a community's civic identity. Inscriptions transmitted cultural memory, but they also controlled it. Monuments could be dismantled and names could be erased. And in an honor and shame society, being remembered was to be honored, and being forgotten was to be shamed. Social and religious rituals and festivals involved acts of remembrance that likewise shaped their recipients and created a sense of belonging. For first-century Jews, their faith and practice were predicated on God having remembered his people and having acted to give them an identity. So the socio-theological aspects of memory and remembrance were instrumental in the creation of a new identity for both Hellenistic and Jewish Christians in the earliest churches. And in this context, Paul's remembrance motifs take on a particular significance. By assuring his recipients that he remembered them before God, Paul affirms their identity as followers of the way. So to gloss Manian PMI in the remembrance motif as mention is to remove the socio-theological impact of Paul remembering his recipients for English readers. Hence my contention that we need to remove this sense from dictionaries and English versions and give English readers the full benefit of this idea of Paul remembering his recipients. Thank you.
Well, that was amazing, Gillian. And I don't think we're going to forget it, are we? So we're always going to remember that we're remembering. Does anybody have any questions for Gillian?
John Theodoridis, more comment on the way you try to explain it. You're trying to explain as a noun. But commonly, nouns are secondary and they derive from the verb. The verb is mnemonevo, which is active. It's an active verb. So in order to mnemonevin, you actively have to recall. So I think that's the gist that you're trying to convey, but by trying to explain it, by trying to explain the verb first, will make it a lot easier for your audience to understand your hypothesis.
Okay, thank you. We do need to consider, though, that the dictionaries and the commentators are trying to make the point that the verb changes its meaning when it's a noun in collocation with the verb to do or to make. So that's where the complicating factor comes in. Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Gillian, for the paper. I wonder, that was David Starling, sorry. I wonder if you could comment on the similarities and differences between when the remembrance formula is used in connection with a Thanksgiving report, as in, say, the Philippians 1 example, or perhaps the Philemon example, where it seems to perhaps include the idea of the fond remembrance of a shared past experience. And on the other hand, the situations where the remembrance formula is used in conjunction with a prayer report, and often the two travel closely together, as for example in Romans 1,
yeah,
where he doesn't have a reservoir of shared past experiences. So the sense seems to be something a little more perhaps like inclusion. As I pray, your name and face is brought to mind, and I include you in my prayers, or in that instance, I include the idea of a visit to Rome in my prayers. So do you think there's past experience referring semantic content in the expression when it's used in conjunction with a prayer report, or only when it's used in conjunction with a Thanksgiving report?
That's such a good question, and it's compounded by the fact in Romans that even though Paul hasn't visited the Romans church, we know from Romans 16 that he actually knows a lot of people in there. So I think in Romans it actually could be both. But I think the major point of Paul's prayer and the remembrance motif is to assure the recipients of his heartfelt prayers for them. And I think the idea of memory there is broader than something directed backwards to say a specific visit or a specific group of people where he knows all of them. And I think certainly with Romans, there are enough people there that he obviously does remember, but I think it touches on both of those factors.
Rosemary Canavan. Thank you so much. And I was just thinking about the connection, particularly in Thessalonians, with the remembering into the rest of the letter, where he continues to say, as you know, and when we were with you. So the sense of that is he emphasizes on the way forward. So I wondered if you'd say something on that.
Yeah, and I think the chronology of Paul's letters plays into this. I think First Thessalonians being an early letter, I think the remembrance motif becomes almost like a little hallmark for him, and who knows the letters that we don't have, what he would have. It's tantalizing, isn't it, to think what he would have opened those letters with. But I think having established a precedent, people like Jerome Murphy O'Connor have looked at the development of the greetings in the openings in Paul's letters, the way he describes himself, the way that tends to develop over the time of his letter writing career. So they're probably things that we have to take into consideration as well.
Well, let's thank Julie again for a wonderful paper. Thank you.
Thank you.